Hello everybody, this is FIDE Master Dalton Perrine, and I welcome you to this live chess playthrough video series that I'm creating here. Throughout this video series, I'm going to be playing 10-minute games in chess.com's live chess room against players within the rating range of about 900 to 1200. The goal of this video series is for you to improve your own play by learning from myself and understanding how a strong player thinks during a game against a lower rated or club level rating of player. I'm going to be talking about the thought process behind my moves, also explaining what my opponent's trying to do during the game, the mistakes they happen to make, and how we can capitalize on those mistakes throughout the game and hope, and how we can win the game. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and hop right into our first game here. Okay, so we have our first game here against Fearful Oatmeal. Interesting name. He starts off the e4. We're going to go ahead and play c5 for the Sicilian. Probably throughout these videos, these 10 videos, I'll be kind of switching up the openings every couple of games, most likely. So white responds with c4 against our Sicilian. We're going to go knight c6. Now, against this particular setup, there's especially this weak d4 square that white has, because the pawn is up on e4 and up on c4. There's no pawn that can go to e3 or c3 to keep this d4 square controlled. So what I'm actually going to do is develop focusing around this square. Notice how all my pieces are going to aim at that particular weakness. And we're going to try to keep full control of that square as best as we can. So we're preventing him from playing d4 because we have 3 defenders and he has only 2, or we have 3 attackers, he only would have 2 defenders. And just developing our pieces, trying to control the center, following the basic principles there as well. So I'm going to go ahead here and I could play knight f6 here. Knight f6 does actually come with the threat of capturing the pawn on e4 due to the knight on c3 being pinned to the rook. Though if I play knight f6, the downside is that it blocks off my bishop's control of d4. So if I go knight f6 and they notice the threat and play something like d3, actually even d3 doesn't work out that well. So actually we are going to go knight f6 and see how white decides to respond here. So if white continues bishop e2, which is probably what he was planning when he played the move b3, we're actually just going to go ahead and grab that e4 pawn because the bishop will be pinning the knight there, still on that diagonal. Best move here is probably something like, oh, d4 is actually not too bad either. Okay, so because I blocked off the bishop, I released a little bit of control on d4. Let's see if there's a way to punish this, though. It seems like we should be able to get away with something here. So we're going to capture the pawn. White's going to take back. I imagine white will take back. Okay, white does capture back. Now, there's a couple different points to, or a couple different things to take note of in this position. White has 2 critical squares in this position and an undefended piece. And also the rook is undefended as well. So a critical square means a pawn or a piece or a certain square that is attacked the same number of times it's defended. So in this case, e4 is attacked 1 time and defended 1 time. d4 is attacked once by the knight and defended once by the queen. And the knight on c3 is defended and the rook on a1 is undefended. So you always want to take note of these kind of weaknesses in your opponent's position. Or from a defensive standpoint, you want to make sure you have less of these weaknesses in your own position. Now, the more critical squares and undefended pieces there are, the more likely there is to be a tactic in the position. Now, we have to find the correct move order here, though. One idea could be to trade the knights. The queen takes back, and then somehow move our knight and open up the diagonal. However, it doesn't work that great. That's not the best way to do things here, necessarily. The next option, which is what I'm going to actually end up playing, I'm actually going to go ahead and just capture the e4 pawn right away, opening up a discovered attack on the knight on d4. And if this knight on d4 moves, I can go past it and capture the knight that's on c3. So we're actually going to grab e4 here. If white recaptures on e4, we take d4. If he moves this knight and maybe takes c6, then we take on c3 with check, and then recapture the knight on c6. So we're going to be up at least a pawn here, if not more, if white plays this incorrectly. So white's best bet here is probably just to take the knight back on e4, let me take d4 and then continue developing, knowing that white will be down a pawn. Now, taking on c6 looks reasonable. I actually have a couple options here. I could even just take back on c6, knowing that the c3 knight is pinned, because the rook is undefended through it. But the best thing to do here, most likely, is just to go ahead and take on c3 with check, an intermezzo here. An intermezzo is defined as a move that you do before recapturing something that your opponent captured previously. In this case, white captured on c6. Instead of recapturing immediately, I throw in a check here, and then I'll recapture on c6 within a move or two. And now it's important that it's a check. If it wasn't a check, then white would be able to grab my queen. But because it's a check, it's a more forcing move compared to white's threat, because he has to deal with the threat on his own king. So white plays bishop d2. I have two options here that are pretty good. I could also take on d2 with check, again, another intermezzo. I could just take back on c6, knowing that my bishop on c3 is defended. I think I'm just going to go for taking on d2. If the queen takes back, then I'll just take back on d2, and we're going to have a little bit of a kind of kamikaze pieces scenario if that happens. If the queen doesn't take on d2 and just plays king e2, then we would probably just recapture the knight on c6. So there's different options here. I could take c6. I'm up a piece. That's clearly better. I could take the queen. White takes my queen. Then I can also capture white's bishop and then recapture the knight, and I'm up a piece there as well. So whether I take the knight now or if I take the queen and the bishop, I'm going to be up a piece either way. But I prefer for the queens to be off the board and up a piece. Generally, when you're ahead material, you want the queens to be off the board. So if I can choose between these two options where I'm up a piece in both lines, I'd rather be up. I'd rather have the queens off the board as well. So I'm going to take f1. Taking f1 is an important move here. If I took the knight back immediately, white would take my knight, and I would only be up, I think, one pawn in that position instead of being up a piece. The problem, though, for white now is that this knight on d8 is trapped, and I'm going to win the knight. Even if he wins my knight, I win his knight, I still have the remaining minor piece in the position. So each of these games, we're definitely going to do analysis of after the game is finished, so I'll be able to go through some of the sidelines here. But just in the heat of the game here, you kind of have to kamikaze the pieces. So white takes on f7, knowing that the knight's a goner, tries to get a pawn out of it. I'm just going to go ahead and simplify at this point. Take his knight, he takes mine, and I'm up a full minor piece right now. White has 6 pawns and 2 rooks. I have 6 pawns, 2 rooks, and a bishop. So I have a solid 3-point advantage. Now I'm just going to focus on getting the bishop developed. And my plan for now is simply just to get the rest of my pieces activated. I'm going to probably try to trade pieces as the game goes on and look to win the resulting endgame here. So let's go ahead and get the bishop in the game. We'll get the rooks involved. And because there's no queens on the board, I don't really mind leaving my king on f7. There's no way that white can attack my king, so my king's not unsafe by any means here. White plays g4 to hit the bishop. I could play bishop d3, but I do have to be a little careful that my bishop doesn't run out of retreating squares. I think I'm just going to drop back to the, probably just back to the d7 square. So again, I'm just going to develop the rooks. Look to hold on to my extra material. Let's put the rook on f8, eyeing, once the king moves, we'll eye the f3 pawn a little bit. I might even be able to focus down this f3 pawn. Put the bishop on c6. Double the rooks up on the f-file and go after this f3 pawn. Let's go ahead with bishop c6. Move the king, double the rooks. White's going to be stuck defending the f-pawn. Not going to be a great situation for him. So b4 has the idea of playing b5 and kicking my bishop back to d7 again. I'm just going to go ahead and play a6 and put a stop to that idea. No need for me to be fancy. No need for me to allow my opponent to do what they want to do. I'm just looking to simplify and play with a reasonable plan here. So I'm just going to go ahead and play king g7. And now that the king is out of the way, my threat is to simply play rook takes f3 with check, win a pawn, White needs to guard that somehow. Let's see what he does. Plays the move rook to d3. So we now have a way to win some more material in this position. Go ahead and pause the video, see if you can find the best move for black in this position. Okay, so the best move for black here, I'm just going to go ahead and play bishop to b5, and I set up a skewer between white's two remaining rooks. I'm now going to win the bishop for the rook, and then I'll be up an entire rook once that happens. White should just probably play like rook back to d1 or move the other rook to d1. At least instead of losing a whole rook, white can just lose the exchange, though it's still going to be a pretty bad position for him. Rook e3, I'm just going to go ahead and take the rook on f1. Now, white could try his own intermezzo, kind of like what we looked at earlier, which he looks like he's trying here with rook takes e7. So similar to what I did earlier, instead of recapturing on c6 immediately, I took on c3 with check and won an extra piece in that line earlier in the game. This is kind of a similar idea, trying to take the pawn with check and then recapture the bishop next move. The problem with this move, though, is that I can play the move king f6. I'm counterattacking the rook and not giving white time to capture my bishop. Now once the rook moves, I move the bishop back, and instead of being up just one rook, I'll be up a rook and an extra bishop as well. So an even bigger material lead. So even with intermezzos, you got to be really careful that your opponent doesn't have a good defense against it. So he'll probably take on b7. I'll just retreat the bishop to b5. And then I'll look to trade his final rook off the board somehow. Let's just get our bishop safe back on b5. Now I'm just going to go ahead and play bishop c6 to guard my pawn on b7. And then just put the rooks in the center of the board, try to put them down around the white king, and look to finish off the game doing that. So I'm just going to go ahead and play king f5 here. Might even just walk my king up and capture the pawn. King e6 was also perfectly good there. Maybe objectively better because that moves the king off the f file and I could take f3 after that. But at this point, as long as I don't make some kind of big blunder, I'm up a rook and a bishop, so it's definitely a just about converting the win here. So let's go ahead and just let's just play rook to e8. Play rook e3, take the pawn on f3. Just look to wrap the game from here. Rook h6. I guess I could go rook e3 here, which is completely winning. For the sake of kind of a teaching point here, even rook h8 is also very strong, looking to trade off white's final rook. And once his final rook's off the board, there's no counterplay that white will have anymore. The rook is kind of trapped on h6. He either has to take me or I'll take him next move. And we'll get rid of his final rook. Decides to sacrifice the rook for the pawn. Don't think that's such a great idea. His 3 pawns are not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Okay, so let's go ahead and, well, he ended up resigning here. So let's go ahead and look at this with an analysis board real quick. I'm going to go ahead and grab the game. Let's go to the live analysis here. Okay, so we'll just rewind the game a bit and flip the board. And let me X out of this. There we go. Okay, so in this game against Fearful Oatmeal, he started off with E4. I played the Sicilian. He played C4. Not that nothing is wrong with C4. White just has to understand that it does weaken D4 a bit, which is what I kind of start to develop my pieces around. After B3, I made the move Knight F6. Now, my idea with Knight F6 is that I'm threatening to take E4 due to the pin on the knight on C3. If White simply does something like Bishop E2, I'll just take the pawn. If he takes back, I take the rook, and I've won the exchange here. I've won a pawn and the exchange, actually, which is pretty good. If he doesn't take the knight back, well, then I'll just trade knights, and then I'll be up a pawn. Another move that White could try is like D3, which looks like it defends the pawn, but D3 doesn't work either, because I can still take on E4. Again, if the knight takes, I get the rook. And if the pawn takes back, the problem with D3 was that now there's no D-pawn guarding the knight. I could still take on C3, I'm up a pawn, and then I could even be up the exchange in that route as well. So White's best move here is probably just to play like maybe just Queen C2, using the queen to guard the pawn. Or Bishop D3 is also working out as well, using the bishop to guard the pawn. E5 is another option that moves the pawn away from being attacked and makes and White makes his own threat. The problem, though, is that the pawn now is, after knight G4, the pawn is kind of lacking protection. We have 3 attackers on it versus 1 defender. Even if he has the queen as a defender, we still have 3 versus 2, so we can just pick up the pawn. And if he tries to use the D4 pawn to guard, well, then we can just take D4, he takes, and then again, we'll just take back on E5 with having won a pawn there. So at the end of the day, the move D4, the move D4 that White played ends up being a mistake as well, but he probably should just play like Bishop D3 or Queen C2 to keep that pawn defended. Now in the game, D4 was played, take, and like I said, the main thing here is that you always want to be on the lookout for critical squares and undefended pieces. Again, a critical square is a square with a piece or a pawn on it, or sometimes even a square that doesn't have anything on it, that's attacked and defended the same number of times. 1 attacker, 1 defender on D4, 1 attacker, 1 defender on E4, then both the knight on C3 and rook on A1 are completely undefended. So the more critical squares and undefended pieces your opponent has, the more likely there is to be a tactic. Many people have asked me before, how do you know if there's a tactic in a position? That's kind of one of the guiding posts in a way of looking for tactics. So knight takes E4 ends up working out pretty well. Now, the other thing you could try is like knight takes D4 and then knight takes E4. The idea that you're attacking the queen, and if the queen takes E4, you take on C3. The problem, though, with this route is that my bishop isn't defended, and White could just take the bishop instead, and I would be losing a lot of material. My rook's attacked, my knight's attacked, I'm already down a piece. That would be very bad. So even though we have a feeling there's a tactic in the position, we still have to play the right move order to make it work. So that was knight takes E4. Now White took on C6, and I played the intermezzo bishop takes C3 with check, which is the important point. Same thing with bishop takes D2 with check again. I captured the queen, he captured mine, and at the end of the day, we're simply ahead a piece, and it's all about just trying to trade down, win more material, improve our pieces, with the knowledge or the benefit that we have an extra piece in this position. So not too much to say from here, just avoid our opponent's threats, watch out for what they're trying to do, and then the bishop b5 wins us a little bit more material. He tries an intermezzo that doesn't work out so well, and we just end up looking for the rook trade and converting the game from there. So that's it for this first game. Be sure to watch the other videos for the future games, and we'll talk more during those games, try to learn what we can from them, different little tidbits of information and ways that we can have a good thought process in order to defeat opponents around this rating range. So that's it for this video. I'll see you around in the next one. Talk to you later.